I'm Bob again, and we're back at the federal courthouse and back here again with Rockman. But we're looking at him from the other side this time. One of the things you may wonder is, where does Rockman live? Well, it turns out Rockman is actually very wealthy and he owns quite a few houses. But his favorite one is Rock House right behind us. And in this chapter we're going to be taking a look at some of the things that have been going on recently at Rock House and how they're related to this federal lawsuit with Lakes and Parks Alliance.
Of course, big houses sometimes have nicknames. Many people call Rock House Minneapolis City Hall. The 345-foot tall tower once had the world's largest four-face chiming clock with faces slightly larger than Big Ben in London. Rock House was designed in 1888, a boom decade that also saw the establishment of the incredible and unique Minneapolis Park System. Considering the size of Minneapolis at the time, the scale was audacious. Looking forward a century, thinking about the world we'd be building and leaving for future generations, was a worldview typical of city leaders of that era. As we enter this building and walk through the atrium, we see in its beauty and rendering a younger, more vibrant, more energetic, and more optimistic vision of what our city and our world could be and can still be.
And we will open up the public hearing. Thank you, Mr. Chair and council members.
On September 15th, some of our current temp contract workers on Rockman City Council held their second municipal consent hearing on Southwest Light Rail. In Chapter 2, we looked at the insane plan to put 2 light rail trains in a tunnel, with mile-long ethanol or other chemical trains rolling over them. Questions about that tunnel plan and what would happen if it can't be built are part of the Lakes and Parks Alliance lawsuit. The tunnel plan and the threat to the homes of nearby residents if it isn't built have emerged as our focus for this chapter.
Please state your name and address for the record.
Good morning, my name is John Shark and I'm from 3145 Dean Court.
Most who spoke at the municipal consent hearing were residents near where the tunnel would be constructed.
I'm a resident of Calhoun Isles and I'm very concerned. We are at the pinch point for the Southwest LRT, which is the most difficult point to engineer.
Here's that graphic again with John's Calhoun Isles residents circled. Here's a larger view. You can see Calhoun Isles a little better. There's also an oval around a row of townhomes on the other side of the pinch point. Calhoun Isles is another building from the Rock House era, but it is aesthetically more beautiful today than when it started out. As part of our Minneapolis commitment to historical preservation, Calhoun Isles was converted from grain elevators to a 10-story condominium building. Calhoun Isles, formerly Grain House, was planted strategically at the branch of 2 old railroad lines. We're looking at that branching point right now. You can see Calhoun Isles through the mostly barren trees. The current Southwest LRT plan follows this route to the left, the Kenilworth Freight Rail alignment. Another alternative we'll be looking at later is to go down the Greenway, the other branch. Unlike Kenilworth, the Greenway has no freight rail today, one of its several major advantages as an LRT route.
Please state your name and address for the record.
Good morning. My name is Craig Westgate. I live at 3523 St. Paul Avenue. I'm also the chairman of SIDNA. I'm also on the CAC for the City of Minneapolis, and I'm also on the Section 106 committee. So this controversy, this topic has taken about 6 years of my life.
Here's that larger view again. Mr. Westgate lives near the larger oval highlighting the row of townhouses. I count 57 of them. As we see here, the townhouses are grouped around a common driveway. The Calhoun Isles condominiums are on the other side of the railroad tracks. When Hennepin County sold the land for this development, there was sort of a half-baked plan for what would emerge as the Southwest Light Rail. But that sort of half-baked plan included removing freight rail from the corridor. Before we get into the details from the municipal consent hearing, let's first look briefly ahead to the real heart of the Lakes and Parks Alliance lawsuit. The environmental review process identifies and evaluates reasonable alternative routes and designs for a project like Southwest LRT. Sometimes the environmental impact of one alternative is so negative that it must be eliminated. Other times, an alternative can and must be modified. But here's the crucial point. People affected by any project have a right. Reasonable alternatives can't be eliminated before the environmental review process is complete. The LPA lawsuit claims the Metropolitan Council has already effectively eliminated all reasonable alternatives to their current plan. This is illegal. Here comes part 2. I organized the public hearing testimony into 4 categories. Here's the first category, tunnel problems.
You will hear about ethanol. And as many cities across the nation are banning the transportation of ethanol within their city limits, not only are we creating a new line, we're going to put people in an electric train underneath it. That's something to really think about when you think about safety, rail safety.
Sue Jeffrey speaking for Friends of Coldwater. I live in Bryn Mawr at 1063 Antoinette Avenue. This is a picture of construction of a tunnel, a light rail tunnel in St. Louis, Missouri. You'll notice up left the tiny garages. The tunnel would be half a mile long with solid steel sides that are pounded down into the earth 55 feet deep. So that's way into the water table. And for those of you who are allowing us to speak, I want to say that this doesn't just affect residents nearby.
The oil and gas trains weigh around 130 tons each for each car. And there's roughly about 50 cars that go down that rail, which is 6,500 tons of explosive material. That's a lot to explode. During construction and afterwards, the cars could collapse the tunnel because they're very heavy.
Regarding rail safety, next door, Lakes and Parks Alliance is having a trial on this issue. That building construction started 1994. 1995, the Oklahoma City bombing happened. 97, it was open. You look at the plaza, you see all the design changes to prevent a terrorist attack from a truck with 7,000 pounds of explosive. I've run the numbers. If you have a chemical train going over a tunnel with 2 light rail trains in the tunnel, you have got 600 times the explosive material on each side of the tunnel. This is an open invitation for terrorist attacks. I've given you a statement here, and I'm asking you to sign one or two of the alternatives. One says that you think that that plan is safe. If you're going to vote for this, I want you to put it in writing that you think this plan is safe.
We're also concerned about the construction phase of the project. For 2 years, this will be a danger to those of us who live there. We know from conversations with both Fire Chief John Friedel and TCNW President Mark Wagner that they do share our concerns.
The plans for construction with business as usual, having freight trains running close to construction where the landscape and soil conditions are compromised, present increased chances for a plan for disaster.
Please come forward, state your name and address for the record.
My name is Doug Peterson. I live at 3315 St. Paul Avenue in Minneapolis, in the townhouses in Kenilworth, or on the Kenilworth corridor. I'm very concerned. I was a CAT member from Sidna on the LRT project. I'm very concerned about the safety of myself and my neighbors, especially during the construction of what has been called the South Tunnel. There is no North Tunnel anymore, but it's the South Tunnel. The Met Council has not in any way addressed any of these safety concerns that have been talked about so far. There's a 5-foot sewer main that goes underneath the trail, and it's 17 feet deep at the top and 22 feet deep at the bottom. That has to be lowered so that the tunnel can be put in there. At the time of lowering that thing, there will have to be a trench that's about 45 feet deep. Because of the soil conditions that some of the people have talked about, the lateral support very likely will be lacking to hold up the train traffic that's going right next to the trench.
Thank you, Mr. Peterson. I need you to wrap up.
There is a very good likelihood of a crash with the sides of the trench failing and wiping out the entire neighborhood. There is no insurance that's going to be covering this. The city of Minneapolis is not going to be able to stand behind sovereign immunity on this thing. So I am asking you to vote no for the consent.
The current proposal calls for tunnels to be built adjacent to Cedar Lake and immediately adjacent to homes. We are told there's no environmental risk to our chain of lakes, and yet this tunnel plan has not been properly vetted through a full environmental review process. We already know that the planners failed to secure even the most basic freight reroute. Do you really trust them to build unstudied tunnels next to our chain of lakes?
So what kind of damage is left? Well, this is where we look at certain things, and we look at the construction of a small building that's being built in our neighborhood right now, the Triggs site. I think many of you are aware. They have tried 3 different forms of foundation that now they're on their 3rd form. Their cost overruns have gone up 350% for the foundation. Is that something that you're willing to take? Well, I'll tell you right now, according to the consultant that they hired, risk and issue management assessment, this is from their own outside consultant that Dayton hired from Accenture.
Mr.
Project
Westgate,
risk
we need you
management
to
role
wrap
is
up.
not defined. Thank you very much.
This graphic shows the Trammell Crow Triggs site. Triggs was the restaurant that used to be here. Apartments are now being built. We'll hear more about this from the next testifier. You can see Calhoun Isles behind it and a large condo group on the right. Hi! Trammell Crow has a new slogan, Think.
Hi, I'm Paul Petrick. I live at 3116 Dean Court, Minneapolis, 55416. I live in the Calhoun Isles Condominium Association. The construction at the nearby Trammell Crow project has raised many concerns about the feasibility of building the shallow tunnel in the southern portion of the Kenilworth corridor. There's great concern that homes will be taken and that the railroad, the bike path, and the LRT will all wind up at grade. The Met Council has identified 2 methods for installing sheet piling for the shallow tunnel, a vibratory hammer or a hydraulic press. The Trammell Crow staff conducted various trials using vibratory hammers to install sheet piles. Damage occurred in the surrounding area and caused abandonment of this method. Even at 180 feet from the site, our association incurred damage. This method must be rejected as it will cause varying degrees of harm to the unique residences in the Sidna neighborhood. The Trammell Crow staff also stated unequivocally that the hydraulic press method to install sheet piling won't work in these soil conditions. The Met Council is now banking that the hydraulic pressing method will work. Instead of hoping, the Met Council needs to develop a detailed and actionable contingency plan for installing an alternate sheet piling system in the Kenilworth corridor. This requirement will prevent a last-minute scenario where the identified methods fail and homes need to be taken by eminent domain and the 3 major transport systems wind up at grade. Given the water table issues and the limited space at the pinch point between Calhoun Isles and Cedar Lake Shore condominiums, this contingency plan will not be a slam dunk. The Calhoun Isles high-rise is 2 to 3 feet from the proposed piling system, while the garage footings are a mere 6 inches from this system. If the Met Council is unable or unwilling to develop and to cost out an alternate piling system for constructing a shallow tunnel, then the city of Minneapolis needs to withdraw municipal consent, as nearly 100 neighbors of ours are at risk of losing their homes. Thank you.
Thank you. My name is Bob Brockway, and I, as well as Paul and John before me, We represent 142 families living in the Calhoun Isles condo complex. With the wall of the LRT tunnel being within 4 or 5 feet of the foundation of our high-rise and less than 35 feet from the townhomes, I have grave concerns about 3 items. First one is temporary living may be necessary for some of the families during the local construction. Second, if there were damage to our building during construction, how are we to be compensated? And finally, if once in operation and our livability adversely affected, how are we to be compensated? In the past, the Met Council has shown no sympathy at all for city residents who have incurred damage due to their projects.
Here's the second public hearing category, co-location and safety.
Thank you, Mr. Chair and council members. I really appreciate the opportunity to speak with you today, and I don't take this lightly. I think this is the first time in my legislative career that I've spoken before the council, so it would be a heartfelt issue for me to do that. I think I spoke to the Planning Commission about the Herc incinerator at one time, but this is my first time before you, and so I appreciate that, and would request that in your deliberations on municipal consent that you include some discussion of freight rail safety issues. Quite a bit of my efforts at the legislature have been focused on ensuring that crude oil trains are transporting this very dangerous cargo safely. Thanks to some of my constituents, the issue of ethanol transportation was on my radar last year. And so I wanted to talk very briefly about why this is important and things that I've learned over the last year since you've addressed municipal consent previously. And that is that studies have shown that ethanol has similar explosive qualities as crude oil. And so when we're looking at these unit trains of ethanol that are traveling through the Kenilworth corridor and downtown Minneapolis, you should understand that we're dealing with a hazardous, highly flammable, hazardous material. Think about it as similar to the Bakken oil trains that are passing through our city. And so once you get that in your mindset, then we have to be very, very adamant about ensuring that public safety is addressed as these trains pass through. So as a result of those efforts, we did include ethanol safety in legislation this past year that was passed in 2015, where we actually called directly on the state to analyze preparedness and impacts of public safety from transportation of ethanol by rail. So this is now on the state's radar.
As Representative Hornstein pointed out, running hazardous freight through urban areas is a hazard to many residents of Minneapolis. Alternates should be looked at. It should go back to the drawing board. There should be no pride of authorship of having carried a project this far, and I've been involved since 2006. Just before I made my move, I was a past president of the Sydney Neighborhood Association. 300,000 people will be in danger from both Bakken oil trains and ethanol freight trains on the TC&W line. There have been 24 accidents in the past couple of years where freight has been derailed, and in many cases it's been followed by explosions and death. Unrelocated freight rail, a promise that was made by the Hennepin County Regional Railroad Authority 16 years ago, maybe 17 now, it's a broken promise, as Mayor Hodges has pointed out to Commissioner McLaughlin.
Here's a map of the blast zone. Pretty big blast zone, a lot of people in there. It's kind of scary. I live in that. Hope I go out with the first wave so that I don't have to suffer trying to breathe.
The leaking glass cloud that the cars, actually, they're not really sealed. They leak, just like your car. In your gas tank in your car, it leaks. If you leave it in the garage long enough, you can smell the gas. And so with the LRT, which has high tension 700 volts co-located with these trains, that gas cloud could be exploded. It's just
Mr. Schrock, I need you to
just a
wrap
little
up,
fact.
please. Thanks.
So they have the high tension wires, and they are a hazard when you co-locate. Thank you very much.
Good morning. I'm George Buzak. I live at 1780 Girard Avenue South, Minneapolis, 55403. My comments are an abbreviated version of the email I sent you folks last evening. The supplemental DEIS is incomplete, inaccurate, and misleading. At 21st Street, it excludes the noise studies of a combined freight and LRT crossing gate bells, sounding at over 100 decibels. Why did the Met Council exclude this data? Is the Met Council hiding the need to add sound walls or soundproof homes? The supplemental draft is also misleading and applies illogical reasoning. In April 2010, during the locally preferred alternative process, you, as Met Council members, voted for Route 3A, relocation of freight. Now, in a footnote buried deep in the 1,400-page supplemental draft, Chapter 2, page 2-6, footnote 7, the Met Council claims that the locally preferred alternative includes both Route 3A relocation of freight and Route 3A-1 co-location of LRT and freight. They claim that the LPA only applies to transit service and that the freight decision is not part of the LPA. Is the Met Council trying to say that Minneapolis and all the cities actually adopted two preferred alternatives, relocation and co-location? Does the Met Council and anyone in this room think that Southwest LRT is only a transit project? How can the Met Council make this claim when they are giving Twin Cities and Western Railroad $260 million public dollars for alignment shifts and upgrades? Is there an alignment that does not require $260 million public dollars for freight? We don't know. The Met Council never included freight rail in the LRT alignment choice. I urge you as our elected representatives to reject the Met Council's proposal. The SDIS uses incomplete and misleading analysis. Thank you.
Thank you.
Really don't like speaking in public, but I care so much about the things I'm reading. Here are some things I just want to know. Did you know? They're just things I happen. These are just some of the things I've read in the past week or so. Regarding the plan to co-locate light rail and freight rail carrying Class 3 flammable material through the Kenilworth corridor, did you know that the Park Board's comment letter on the SDEIS says, the presence of freight rail and its impacts on the users of the Kenilworth corridor has not been fully addressed in the SDEIS from the perspective of any failure of the freight rail infrastructure and the ability to respond to an emergency condition. The Met Council has reportedly only ever met with the fire chief once, despite the fact that the SDIS says LRT will cause emergency vehicle delays of 50 seconds, 12 times per hour at 3 upgrade locations, plus, of course, the delays from the freight rail trains passing by.
Mr. Alexander had suggested that nothing has changed since the last time that you had municipal consent to consider. In fact, much has changed. First of all, there has been the SDEIS, which did not answer many of the concerns that we have as citizens and that we deserve responses to. Secondly, we've learned quite a bit about the dangers of running ethanol-laden trains with millions of gallons of explosive ethanol next to the electrically charged Southwest LRT lines. As close as 15 feet in some places. As has been noted, this route goes through our residential area. Locating Southwest LRT close to the freight line would drastically increase the risk of an explosion.
The planners of the project, first Hennepin County and then the Met Council, advanced project plans without properly delivering on the implicit promise to the city of Minneapolis that freight would be relocated. It was a very basic expectation, and yet they advanced the Southwest LRT planning prior to ensuring that the reroute would happen.
No co-location was at the heart of agreeing to this choice. Mayor Rydick got duped. He said yes to Kenilworth, but the Met Council reneged on their promise. On safety, due diligence for the risks of co-location was the responsibility of the Met Council. In my opinion, the whiteboards used at public meetings, which was a representation of the DEIS, were a whitewash. They had everything covered, yet they hardly addressed the real dangers of co-location to riders and residents if a train carrying ethanol or other flammables exploded.
Big money fuels big momentum. In terms of construction, we don't have to look far from this address to see the evidence of that. It is my opinion, however, that such momentum can allow for the possibility that those in a position to halt this momentum for reconsideration in the face of reasoned opposition will yield to the script of those holding the hand of big money. We hear such comments as, the project is too far along. We've spent too much money so far. We'll stand in the way of progress. And in one televised committee meeting, I heard, no one wants to see this project die. For the record, and repeating something you have heard many times before, this project should have been suspended until relocation of freight rail was assured. The failure of that to happen has been at the rocky foundation of the continuation of this flawed and ill-conceived Southwest LRT alignment. You have heard a litany of dangerous and destructive elements in the project. Is it futile for me to think that you, who have the means to challenge and perhaps stop the continuation of this travesty in construction, will do so? I support LRT expansion, but I oppose this alignment. And I ask you to vote no for municipal consent. Thank you.
A vote yes means endangering lives, including my life and my children's lives. We're in the blast zone. We live right there. And also first responders who, as I speak, are saying that they feel hopeless. They say that they don't know how they're going to get to the site, the construction site, or any place where there's co-location.
Here's the third public hearing category, alternatives and equity.
The light rail project, as it is presented, is a bad deal on every respect for the city of Minneapolis. Kenilworth was never first choice for the location of light rail, but rather the third or fourth choice when considering service to the people of Minneapolis who really could use rapid transit as a means of equity.
Did you know that in your comment letter, the city's comment letter on the SEIS, the city asked for ridership by station, including reverse commute, new to transit, and transit dependent, saying that calculating the number of reverse commute riders is an important equity measurement that needs to be shown station by station. If you don't have this information, how can you evaluate the equity of spending all this money on this project?
Another problem is that this train will not service the two highly populated metro deserts. The north side has been completely ignored except for some buses. And we have a huge parking lot called Uptown, which is a venue in itself, a wonderful place. Restaurants, theater.
We need you to wrap up.
I urge you to reject this and to send the trains where the people live, rather than through the parks.
It should be relocated, and alternatives for the light rail should be looked at, including running it down the Midtown Greenway or out the Burlington Northern Corridor to St. Louis Park West End, which is already a highly developed area.
I'm Barbara Lundy. I live at 2794 Xerxes Avenue South, and I'm opposed to the present alignment. How many of you drove here today and parked here? Please show your hands if you drove here. Okay. I got on the bus at Lake and Dean Court, and it comes every 9 minutes, and rode here in about 15 minutes. So, in my opinion, this route is not necessary. I didn't take a parking space here or emit any extra gas. I was just a passenger on the bus. So, thank you for listening to my testimony, and please do not vote for this approval.
I want to say that voting yes means putting wealthy, privileged, primarily white, sports-loving suburban people first, and shelving residents who need, want, and deserve equitable mass transit system.
The minuscule ridership numbers in Minneapolis, which do not address urban equity, and in fact take 6,000 cars off the road by 2040, are not worth it. There are other alignments that serve Minneapolis better and won't risk our lakes. Will they be complicated and protracted and delayed? For sure. But our chain of lakes is worth it. Thank you.
Please remember that this is only a proposed route. The Met Council has assured us in court that this is only a proposed route and that there are others. Across the nation, policymakers are trying to remediate dangerous situations like this. We ask you to please make the safety of citizens your top priority and to vote against this particular dangerous route and ask the Met Council to pursue a safer one. Thank you.
Here's the fourth public hearing category, environmental.
The problem with putting a huge long tunnel that's very deep is that the water's not going to move around. All the lakes are connected. This year, Lake Hiawatha was closed for swimming at the end of June. Last year, 2 of the 3 beaches at Calhoun were closed. This is just going to compound it. You need fresh water flushing through the system. All water in Minneapolis, well, most of the water in Minneapolis drains through Minnehaha Creek and into the lakes. There are 29 sewer outlets into Calhoun. I think the future of swimming and fishing in the city of Minneapolis is the new $7 million pool at North Minneapolis on Weber Parkway.
You will also probably not hear things about soil and sound mitigation, of which there is no money in the Southwest Light Rail budget to take care of the after effect of what's happened to this. We can talk about the environment, how they will be digging down as much as 48 feet into the water table of our city's theme, the chain of lakes. And even when this is complete, they will be pumping water out of this tunnel into our soils forever.
Before you vote, I ask you to please ask yourself, if this proposed route went through your ward and your ward's constituents raised concerns and opposition to it, would you still be supportive of it? Because when it comes to our bike paths, our green space, and our chain of lakes, the entire city is your ward and your responsibility.
Beyond the issue categories, an overarching theme emerged at the hearing: distrust and cynicism. Councilmember Lisa Goodman begins her own comment with this theme. We'll hear more testimony on it, followed by Councilmember Goodman's comment in its entirety.
I wish to yield the floor to Councilmember Goodman, who represents much of this area and is probably the senior participant as an elected official on this issue.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. I didn't plan on speaking today. I don't serve on this committee. I was here to hear the comments, the very eloquent comments of my constituents, but I have to really at this point echo the comments of one person more than anybody else, and that's Sari Brenner, because I feel like what she said is really illustrative about how so many people feel. When Councilmember Gordon talks about the lack of democracy within railroads, let's talk about the lack of democracy at the Met Council.
Sarah Brenner, 2526 Upton Avenue South. I'm not going to talk to you directly about why you should not give consent to SWLRT, about the inadequacy of the SDEIS, or the dangers of co-location with running highly volatile, hazardous ethanol freight immediately adjacent to 35-foot construction pits and electrified trains. I won't even talk to you about the vote, for I'm skeptical enough to believe that each of your votes will likely be exactly the same as it was in the previous round of municipal consent. Instead, I want to talk to you about how cynical I and many of my fellow citizens of Minneapolis feel about the political process that has led us to this point. We thought you stood with us. We thought you represented us. Instead, you traded our safety and security under ugly threats in a dirty backroom deal for some other favor that the Met Council, an undemocratic, unelected body of government, had the power to grant. I used to be an idealist, believing in the power of what was right and what was just, and in the process of democracy. But this political process has been so vulgar and so disgusting. It makes some of us fight harder, but it also makes many more people just give up, and I've seen a lot of people do that. If it weren't for a single politician, I might be one of those who just gave up. But fortunately, we have Minnesota Congressman Frank Hornstein, who's willing to discuss the very real dangers of running 100-unit trains of ethanol and crude oil alongside LRT and underneath the Twin Stadium. We don't even allow a single high-hazard tanker semi with only 7,000 gallons of gas to go through the Loring Tunnel, but we allow a 100-unit freight train with 2 million gallons of
Ms.
oil
Benner,
go underneath the
we need
Twin
you to
Stadium.
wrap up.
Okay, all right. We elect you to be our advocates. Surprise us by doing the right thing and protecting us, and don't allow co-location. It's in your power to change this. Thank you.
I'm sure you feel hopeless too. I'm guessing that you feel pressure from Hennepin County and developers and legislature, and state government, and maybe from each other as well, your fellow council members. But I'm here to apply voter pressure and tell you that we feel very personal about this, and we voted for you. We really are counting on you to vote no.
I'm Jeanette Colby, and I live at 2218 Sheridan Avenue South, and I'm currently the chair of the Kenwood Isles Area Association, but I'm speaking on my own behalf. I've been involved with this project for a long time, and what I can say to you today is that in addition to the changes that were presented by Mr. Alexander, what's changed since you last voted is that the SDEIS has been published, and I'm here to ask you to read the public responses to that SDEIS, especially the ones from Kenwood, Sidna, and LRT done right. The problem with the SDEIS is that, as you've heard, there have just been too many issues that haven't been dealt with in that study, issues that were minimized, ignored, or underplayed. And these are things that are really critical to the livability and safety of Minneapolis. Some of these issues include co-location, public safety, noise, hydrology, and I would just ask you that you look at some of these questions from us, from your staff, that haven't been answered and that we keep asking. We've been asking for years and without answers. So I would ask you to read some of those responses, ask the questions, and get serious answers that are committed to. Thank you very much.
But the fact is, the legislature canceled $30 million that they had put into Southwest Light Rail. There is no more money going in. There's $15 million that the legislature has put in so far. The budget calls for $165 million. You're $150 million short. You're voting on a dead plan. That's point one. And the reason for this is that the Met Council in this whole process has lost so much credibility over the legislature, you're not going to get this done. So it's easier to smile about this thing because we're winning.
Make your children and grandchildren proud and vote no for municipal consent to the project as it is. Thank you.
Now we'll go back to hear Councilmember Goodman's entire comment.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. I didn't plan on speaking today. I don't serve on this committee. I was here to hear the comments, the very eloquent comments of my constituents. But I have to really, at this point, echo the comments of one person more than anybody else, and that's Sari Brunner, because I feel like what she said is really illustrative about how so many people feel. When Councilmember Gordon talks about the lack of democracy within railroads, let's talk about the lack of democracy at the Met Council. An unelected group of people appointed by a political appointee charged with building out the regional transit system in the region without much concern for the people who are most affected. Imagine being someone who lived in a home that you've purchased and your entire amount of equity is in it, and they're talking about building a tunnel 2 feet from your building. Imagine the level of uncertainty you would feel and the lack of trust you would have when you read an SDIS followed from a DIS that says there's not going to be any problem with that. You don't need to be an engineer to understand why people have some serious concerns. And I know the fix is in. I understand where the votes are. I'm very clear about the fact that there are a lack of people on this council willing to take on the Met Council. And I understand that. I understand it's politics, but I'm not one of those people. I feel like I was elected to represent my constituents' point of view, and you mark my words, there's going to be a problem with this. There's no possibility they're going to be able to dig the way they're suggesting that they're going to dig to build a tunnel in this pinch point without affecting a massive number of people. You can see the example of it right now with the Trammell Pro construction project, where a building that is even further away, and some of the buildings are much further away, have experienced fairly significant damage from this exact same system that they're talking about using at this pinch point. So I don't want to be here saying I told you so. I'll probably be long retired by the time I have to tell people so. But I think that this is a serious enough issue that I wish more people would pay attention to it. I do appreciate the efforts on behalf of Representative Hornstein. I don't want to put him on the spot, only to say you're going to have another shot at this because the legislature is going to make the final decision about whether or not this is something that should be funded. I think Mr. Carney is correct in that regard, and this fight is not over in that sense. I also want to note that to say that this project is coming in on budget is the most ludicrous thing I've ever heard. That's because the budget keeps going up. I am proud of the fact that Council Members Reich, Glidden, and the Mayor's office negotiated a situation where we're not going to be losing any stations in Minneapolis. I do think that our professional staff and elected officials did an extremely good job of making sure that we made it through municipal consent without further damage, and we did take a lot of criticism in the media for not contributing financially to the project. I'll tell my constituents in no small way was that a victory for us. But in the end, I put myself in the shoes of Sari Brenner, who I think says it best when she says, "Who is looking out for us? I have lost faith in the system." Sari, I tell you, I've lost faith in the system a long time ago. It's partially why I ran for re-election unopposed, to be able to represent my constituents' point of view. And I put myself in your shoes every day. I'm in the blast zone. I don't live in this immediate neighborhood, and I feel like our system has failed my constituents, and that will be one of many, many regrets we have down the line. Thank you for your time.
Thank you.
Here comes part 3. We'll hear excerpts from the City Council's September 25th discussion and final approval of municipal consent for the current Southwest Light Rail plan, including the South Tunnel in the Kenilworth Corridor. We'll start with the full comments of Council members Lisa Goodman and Blong Yang.
On item 1 then, Councilmember Goodman.
Thank you, Madam President. My office has worked to prepare 4 pages of talking points. For me this morning, I probably don't need a single page of talking points to talk about this issue that's been part of my career for the better part of 15 years. So I probably don't need to look at a talking point to talk about the way that this project has come about. But I'm not going to bore any of you with the history of this because I know exactly what the outcome of this is going to be. And so often you speak to educate the public and your colleagues about an issue, and here no one really needs any further education. You often speak about an issue in order to persuade your colleagues that to see things a different way, and clearly there isn't going to be any change in votes or persuasion despite all of the new information that's come out with regard to the SDIS to date. But I am going to make a couple of points that I don't know have been fully made regarding this project. I want to start with the words of Judge Jack Thunheim, who chastised the Met Council, and they know it, about the fact that they have picked this alternative prior to the time that any kind of full environmental review has been complete. Through much of this process, the Met Council has had a clear favorite route for Southwest LRT, While the agency involved can state a substantive preference, the unique nature of municipal consent in Minnesota for light rail projects and the significant drumbeat of support by the Met Council assembled for a single route certainly comes close to having the practical effect of limiting the available options, and that the remaining federal environmental review is meaningless. By reaching an agreement with St. Louis Park that results in freight traffic remaining in this corridor, the Met Council has come dangerously close to impermissibly prejudicing the ongoing environmental review process. That is more than a slap on the hand from the judge. The bottom line is the environmental review process still has not given us all of the information that we need to feel comfortable moving forward. And I want to talk specifically about the safety implication of locating freight rail trains carrying large amounts of ethanol through a corridor that is 32 feet from people's homes and 2 feet from the foundation of the grain elevator condominium buildings. This is a new and serious impact. Many of my colleagues have been involved in freight train safety issues, including Councilmember Reich, and thank goodness he's working to bring forward some language. But the truth of the matter is the rail lines have tremendous control over what happens in our city. What they don't have to control is the idea of building a tunnel and putting people in light rail trains underground while moving ethanol trains above, and hoping that whatever piling system the Met Council is able to come up with to have those two things located one over the other in a pinch point of 56 feet and pray that there won't be an accident, I think is some sort of wishful thinking. I also want to talk a little bit about this pile driving issue. Many of you have heard about what's happening at the Trigg site currently in my ward, where they've had to stop the construction of a new building that's about 100 feet from an existing building because of the impacts of the vibratory drilling that's going on in order to put in those foundations. We have this exact same problem in this corridor where the soils are questionable and hydraulic high frequency vibratory hammer method clearly is going to provide risks to adjacent buildings. These grain elevators that we just voted that grain elevators are historic in our city, and they've been there for a long period of time. They're going to be talking about using a method that is 2 feet from their foundation. I don't think you need to be an engineer to figure that hydraulic, high-frequency vibratory hammering could potentially be a problem for the foundation of a condominium building over 10 stories tall, immediately next to their homes. And this hydraulic press method that's been discussed is good when the soil is good, but it's not when the soil is not good. So I think one of the biggest problems we have today is we're going to go ahead, you guys are going to go ahead and move this forward, and in the end, they're not going to be able to build the tunnel. Because we know that there are all sorts of issues with the soils and these methods. And then they're going to be right back at us, God knows how many dollars later in this process, stating that they're going to have to basically co-locate at grade, but they can't do that because of the pinch point without taking out 87 townhomes, which have a total current tax base of over $36 million and affect the lives of more than 100 families. And that's just on the townhome side. Any kind of problem with any kind of issue on the other side would result in the loss of the grain elevator condominium buildings, and any kind of construction in this corridor could put at risk that building. And the Met Council's track record on working on these projects to make things palatable for the neighbors in my ward is pitiful. There was a sewer project, a sanitary sewer project that happened in my ward last year down 28th Street. And basically when damage was done to properties, the Met Council's response was file a lawsuit against the contractor. So these neighbors are left with a situation where a unit of government is saying, we're not really going to be responsible because we hire a contractor to do this work. And 11 neighbors actually ended up suing the Met Council, and they did settle with a few of them. And the rest of them actually had damage to their homes as the result of a sewer project that they never were able to remedy with the Met Council. This whole concept of an unelected board doing massive work like this outside people's homes that damage their homes, I think is a problem, and it's going to be a bigger problem on this project moving forward. So we know basically that the Met Council staff, all of them sitting out here today, super excited about the fact that we're going to move forward, are actually kind of thinking, I think she's kind of right about some of these issues. But we're just going to press forward because this project is too big to fail, because all of the pressure coming down from every institution, from the Downtown Council to the Star Tribune editorial board to the governor's mansion, has said we're going to make this work. We're going to fit this square peg into a round hole, and we don't care what the outcome is going to be. So I have some level of sympathy for my constituents. I would hope there are others who have sympathy for the fact that these are residents of the city of Minneapolis who have tremendous concerns about what potentially could happen from an environmental point of view, but also from a construction point of view, to the single biggest asset that they own, which are their homes. And so I realize my speaking on this isn't going to change one person's point of view, but I feel the need to speak out. I don't know that I'll still be elected and on this council when they come back to us to talk about taking townhomes and taking people's homes out, or dealing with damage or potentially an ethanol spill in this corridor, that some of you might be here and you'll remember my words.
Councilmember Yang.
Thank you, Madam President. I've struggled with this vote, and I think Councilmember Goodman is right in a lot of what she said, and I do have a lot of sympathy for a lot of her constituents and a lot of the folks that came to testify at this public hearing, but the last public hearing too. Those words that folks said with regards to their neighborhoods and the impact on their lives, are very real. And I pray that nothing bad ever happens, but I do see the concerns, and I think the folks that are talking about their concerns and about just the potential harm that can be done to them in the blast zone and those sorts of things, it's very real. And it's tough to take a vote like this, but I guess in some ways we just have to balance what's good for some folks over other folks. And as Councilmember Goodman had said in the past, sometimes in these situations you have to just pick winners and losers. And I hope that I don't regret the vote that I'm taking, but certainly I've heard all the concerns, and I take them very seriously. And I hope we don't come back for a third round of municipal consent. That would just be insane. So just want to put that out there.
Councilmember Bender.
Thank you, Madam President. This is a bit unusual, but there's been several questions that have come in from my constituents and others, and I wondered if staff could help address those.
The council suspended the rules to allow testimony of Metro Council staff. We'll hear their responses to questions relevant to the proposed tunnel.
Thank you, Madam President. Councilmember Bender. Craig Lamothe, Project Director for Southwest LRT.
The second question is, I wondered, Councilmember Goodman has raised in this entire process a number of very important questions about construction methods and their impacts on water quality, on adjacent properties, and I wondered if someone could address some of those questions, particularly about the construction methods.
Madam President, Councilmember Bender, as we continue to advance the design, as we get more and more closer to the time of construction, we're continuing to take a look at the actual construction staging and the construction methods we'll be using, continuing to do additional research on making sure that we're using the best practices in the corridor, regardless of whether it's being tunnels or bridges or just track work, as we continue to go along, and we'll continue to do that as well to ensure that we're using the most sustainable and the best practices out there in the industry.
And then finally, what would happen if there was a major change to the project, either between now and when construction began, or if something happens during construction? What would be the process to revisit the decision that we've made today or to change the project going forward?
Madam President, Councilmember Bender, specifically to Councilmember Goodman's question about the tunnel potentially not being there, that would trigger another round of municipal consent to have to come back. That's a substantive change underneath that statute, so we would have to come back before council to get approval to take a tunnel out if that were to be the case.
Any further discussion? Councilmember Goodman?
Thank you, Madam Chair. I'm glad that Councilmember Bender asked that question about the tunneling methods, and since it wasn't answered, other than we're going to use some great theories that we have. I mean, essentially what you said was nothing, and I don't think I'm the only one that thinks that. I'd like to know, actually, Specifically, since I know a little bit about this, are you going to be using the hydraulic high-frequency vibratory Hammond method, or are you going to be using the hydraulic press-in method, one which has been negative towards the Triggs building, the other which has soil issues? Which of those methods specifically will you be using? And if it's the first one, how will you not have a similar outcome to what happened at the Triggs site?
Sir?
Yes, President Johnson. My name is Jim Alexander. I'm the Director of Design and Engineering, and I'd like to address Councilmember Goodman's questions.
Please go ahead.
In terms of the construction, what we're currently contemplating is we would do a hydraulic press-in method. We have done over 60 borings, explorations throughout the corridor, so we have a very good handle on what the soil conditions are in that area. We've also done a lot of investigation on the foundations that the council member has spoken of that are nearby the tunnel that's going to be built or proposed to be built. And we believe that based on our analysis, and we've had an independent look at this as well, that this hydraulic press-in method is a suitable means of doing that. And we're continuing to advance that. We're 60% design approximately about right now. We have more work to do, and we'll continue to work with the city staff as we proceed with our design efforts on this to understand more about these construction methods. But that's currently how we're contemplating the approach.
Any further discussion on this item? Seeing none, I'm just going to speak briefly. I come to this decision from a long time service on the Metropolitan Parks and Open Space Commission, where this particular area, the chain of lakes, is the most visited park in the regional park system. That hasn't changed over the 34 years, I guess, since I started my service there. I find it interesting, actually, as someone who's represented neighborhoods over the years, I was always a little bit jealous of some of the attention that was given to airport traffic and airport noise and expenditures of dollars for mitigating airport traffic, because I have a rail line that really separates my northern part of my ward from the southern part of my ward. And it's been around. I used to live about 2 blocks away from it when I was growing up, and it continues to be a huge barrier for the people in my ward in the northern half, both for public safety and just rail crossings. And of course, because of the increased traffic of oil trains and increased economy and the efficiency of rail shipping, that problem has considerably worsened for some of my constituents. And actually, I think some of the challenges Councilmember Reich is going through with train expansion in his ward are an attempt to relieve some of the congestion in my ward. So we have been aware over the years, those of us who live in the far reaches of North Minneapolis, that train traffic is a challenge. Personally, in the home that I lived in before I lived in this one, I was evacuated 3 times for problems. One time forklift pierced an ammonia truck and released an ammonia cloud in my neighborhood. We had to leave our neighborhood. Twice there is a fertilizer company that shipped fertilizer, and 2 fires in that company then made us leave our home. So this train stuff, I'm not happy, but I'm grateful that the recognition of the challenges of train traffic in our community are being realized. Now, I went to a Botno, I think, corridor management committee. I lose track of all the different kinds of committees that are associated with these light rail decisions, and had a call yesterday from my park commissioner who confirmed that we have challenges with Botno as well. Botno goes next to Theodore Wirth Park. It's a different situation. It's grade separated, so it's lower, but there are people that are really riled up about that. And because it goes through a significant wetland, when it gets into Golden Valley, there is a new kind of engineering that I had never heard of before. A new word. I had to go back and look it up in the dictionary about how to build a track on some sort of piling supported on a platform. And, what's the increased cost of that? We don't have an estimate. That's what I heard at the committee. So I think, we're being led down the same sort of a path in the Botno with a little less complication than, say, the 600,000 users that use the Kenilworth corridor every year. So I just think we have to be cognizant of these challenges and also cognizant of the public purse, because it just keeps going up and up and up and up, and you think, you know, at what point you say enough is enough. So I won't be supporting this today. Any further discussion on the Transportation and Public Works item number 1? Seeing none, clerk call the roll.
The full council approved municipal consent 10-3, with council members Lisa Goodman and Cam Gordon and council president Barb Johnson casting the no votes. This was exactly the same vote as the original approval of municipal consent. Here comes part 4. Hi. Good time or bad time?
Perhaps later, because I'm focusing on the agenda.
Sure. I wanted to give you this thing. It's got transcripts of citizens on page 4 and 5 that testified at the hearing.
Oh, okay.
And I'll give you another copy of this letter. I was passing out material at the council's final vote meeting right up to the start.
Under all this regularly scheduled meeting, the Minneapolis City Council to order, clerk call the roll.
Councilmember Wisconsin. Try. Here.
In this section, we'll focus on what the media has and has not reported.
Right.
Here. We'll see the mainstream media in action in its natural habitat.
And then I just saw there was a news release from the Park Board this morning that they've approved the bridge designs.
Yes, they did that Wednesday night.
Okay, so that's a hurdle that you guys have cleared now at this point.
I mean, I'll just respond, Dylan, to say that we're very pleased with the Park Board's action on Wednesday night.
I wasn't the only reporter interested in listening into the interview Dylan Thomas was conducting.
I've got a question for you. I have a question for you. You're a reporter. Now, have you received my information saying that the fire chief, Minneapolis fire chief, has questions about the safety of the tunnel? Have you asked anybody at the Met Council about that? Okay.
This is a good time to briefly summarize what I had done from the release of Chapter 2 of this series, featuring a brief interview with Minneapolis Fire Chief John Friedel, and the municipal consent hearing and final vote. Without repeating the Chapter 2 content, here's the brief interview with Chief Friedel, who clearly wanted what he said on YouTube and reported on.
We got time for a quick question?
What's that?
I'm doing a documentary on the Southwest Light Rail Plan in the Twin Cities. And the current plan is to have mile-long chemical trains that are going above, a little bit offset, but they're going above a half-a-mile tunnel. And there can be up to 2 light rail trains in that tunnel. Do you think that's safe?
Not, well, without looking at the way you described it, it certainly is questionable, you know, how that would look. Certainly want to see the plan on that, what that would look like going forward. And I'd like to be a part of that plan, to be able to look at that. And I think, you know, so far, I've only had one meeting with talking about tunnels and the length of tunnels. I'm always concerned about that, as I am concerned about what goes over above them. You know, so it's always a concern. Then I just hope that my hope that the first responders are certainly actively involved in that planning process and what that looks like, and to meet our response needs.
Here's his verbal identification, followed by comments as he was walking away.
I'm the Chief Minneapolis Fire Department, Chief John Friedel.
Okay, real good. Thank you.
Okay. So that's going to be on YouTube.
It is. That's a fact. After releasing Chapter 2, I sent out this news release to over 200 media contacts, including Janet Moore at the Star Tribune, Peter Callaghan at MinPost, who we just saw confirming its receipt, and Dylan Thomas at the Southwest Journal. The news release included a complete transcript of my interview with Chief Friedel. I reported hand-delivering a letter to Mayor Hodges' office and all city council members, calling on them to sign a statement saying they thought the tunnel plan was safe if they planned to support municipal consent. No response to this letter was received from any council member or from the mayor. My news release concluded with this statement: Chief Friedel's safety concerns about the Kenilworth Tunnel Plan and his hope that first responders are certainly actively involved in that planning process comes more than a year after the Minneapolis City Council approved municipal consent for an essentially identical Kenilworth plan on a 10-3 vote. I am calling on and challenging the mainstream media to investigate and report on how and why Minneapolis first responders have apparently been so incredibly marginalized in the Southwest LRT planning and municipal consent process, and to investigate whether the Kenilworth Tunnel Plan is, in fact, safe or incredibly dangerous. That's my view of it. I am particularly concerned about the danger of a terrorist attack on a mile-long train hauling Bakken crude oil. This safety issue, and specifically the danger of a terrorist attack, is covered in depth in Chapter 2 of my video series, so of course I encourage everyone to view all of Chapter 2. We're back now to our continuing study of the mainstream media in their natural habitat after the City Council final vote on the second round of municipal consent.
Can be proud of and
350% increase in costs because they have to change their various methods. You know, as you know, we're at 1.77 already. What's the appetite? You know, even if the Republicans approve it. So what's going to happen if they have to put those? The only way to put them at grade is to go to townhomes, and that's what Lisa was talking about.
Are you all going to lobby the legislature?
You bet. You bet. Which, you know, just off the record.
For the record, this is a public building. I don't believe in the idea of so-called safe spaces. I did not agree that anything anyone was saying was off the record. But having said all this, just to be a nice guy, I won't include the audio of what was said. I'm covering this as news. Has anybody from the media asked any of you about the Minneapolis Fire Chief's safety concerns about the tunnel plan?
I don't know if anybody from the media has been asking, but we've had conversations with the fire chief on the project.
You when was the most recent one?
I don't recall the exact date,
Mm-hmm.
but we've had multiple meetings with the fire chief on this, and we'll continue to do so as we move through the design.
But no one from the, for example, MinPost or the Star Tribune or Southwest Journal has asked you about this. Is that correct?
Well, Bob, I think you'd have to speak with our press coordinator to understand what kind of questions have been asked. I'm not necessarily dialed into all the press questions.
Okay, thank you.
Yeah, Mark.
Got a question?
I'm not being
You're aware that the Minneapolis Fire Chief has raised concerns about the safety of this?
do my job
Have you
now,
asked anybody about
thank
that?
you, Bob.
Speaking of doing your job, have you asked anybody about the Met Council about these safety concerns?
Why don't you ask? You're a journalist.
I'm doing that. I just asked him whether the Met Council has been asked by anybody from the Star Tribune, MinPost, or Southwest Journal as to safety concerns about a mile-long chemical train that can have 600 times the explosive weight of the bomb that destroyed the Oklahoma City building on each side of the tunnel with 2 light rail trains in it when it's sent it over that tunnel. Has anybody from the mainstream media asked you about this? Minneapolis Fire Chief on YouTube, I've interviewed him. He said he's concerned about it and he wants to be involved in the planning process. He'd like to see this plan. He says he's essentially hasn't been involved. What's your comment on this?
Well, Bob, I think the important thing to rather than the media asking the questions are we working with the city? We are.
Mm-hmm.
And we've had many conversations with the city staff as well as the fire chief, and we'll continue to do so.
Mm-hmm. And of course, my concern is whether the media is doing its job, and that's one of the issues that I'm raising in this process. And of course, this is Janet Moore, who's the Star Tribune reporter covering this. So I just want you to know I'm going to continue to raise this, and I hope you take a look at my video of Chapter 2 of the Minneapolis Fire Chief talking about this.
His pieces are large, all on them, stone, you know.
Janet, do you have some questions?
Thank you.
I do.
Did you have something you want to say?
Yes,
Yeah.
we wanted
Mhm.
to
Yeah.
speak with another
Okay.
member of the
Certainly.
media in
Okay.
your absence, Bob. Thank you.
Okay, very good. I'll accommodate you. This is a public building.
But it's also technically in Golden Valley, so.
Right.
Yeah, right. So it's enormous, the ecological damage that will be done.
Okay.
And it won't be just restricted to that corridor because, as we all know, the environmental system, and so you're talking about wildlife. I mean, you go through there, you see deer, you see all kinds of wildlife, and it's not going to be there anymore.
But we need to maintain our identity as the city of Lakes, or we're just going to be the city of stadiums.
Yeah. Okay. Well, thank you very much. Yeah.
That's the elephant in the living room.
Yeah. And you're the one who always brings that up. So anyway,
I've got a couple of questions.
Thank you. It's Dylan Thomas. I write for the Southwest Journal.
Yeah. I read all your stuff. Yeah. This is crazy. Did you see the Hill and Lakes Press thing? Boy,
Michael just gave me the
most
recent issue.
Yeah.
Which I always read.
The best thing I thought was those little spot interviews of like 10 people. Mary Paddock was one of them.
No, those are transcripts of the testimony.
Yeah, but I mean, it was powerful. I thought that was like fabulous. Thank you for your work. I do like your shoes a lot.
Oh, thank you. You're gonna end up on YouTube now too.
We don't want to issue a shoe issue.
Yeah. Oh man, Rob, I'm the interviewer, not the interviewee.
Well, are you sure about that? You're a reporter covering this issue. I am covering the role of the media in reporting on this issue as part of my coverage.
Right.
So I have a question for you. You're getting my news releases, is that correct?
Yes.
Okay. Now, did you take a look at Fire Chief Friedel's statement about his concerns about the safety of having a mile-long chemical train with either Bakken crude or ethanol going over a half-a-mile tunnel with 2 light rail trains in it? That's 600 times of the weight of the explosive material that was used in the Oklahoma City bomb on each side of the entrance when it's centered.
Okay, I can't recall exactly what I read in your press release, but I have spoken with fire and emergency response officials.
Have you spoken with Chief Friedel recently?
About this exact issue. I have not spoken with Friedel recently, no.
Could you follow up with him on this? And I encourage you again to take a look at that, because one of my big concerns...
In my last story, I spoke directly with both fire department and the city's emergency management department about these exact issues. So we're on the same page. I'm trying to track this stuff as well. So.
Okay, well, I hope you'll take a look at it. And I also gave you a 4-pager. Yes. And I'll follow up with contact to you on that.
All right, sounds good.
Thank you.
Thanks.
And during construction, you still have the freight train going through, and it's still carrying millions of gallons of ethanol.
Of course, another possible explanation has emerged in this chapter for why the mainstream media is not reporting on any possible safety issue with the tunnel. It could be that these reporters have concluded, as many others have, that the tunnel simply cannot be built, in which case whether it would be safe or not is a moot question. We'll be following up on this possibility going forward in this series.
And you can talk to the TCNW people, and they are concerned that this wall is not going to hold.
So this is what is this made out of? Wood? What is that?
I don't know what they would make it out of.
Or are these just temporary pilings?
Yeah, this is just temporary to build the tunnel through. But with a lot of water pressure, that won't hold. I mean, and then the sides go down 55 feet. 55 feet! Whoa! In this, like, wetland area.
So, do you think that if it comes down to a third round of, say they get going on this, it doesn't work out, there's a trade situation, do you think the third round of municipal consent? I mean,
well,
it sounds
I don't know.
like some of these people have municipal consent fatigue a little bit.
Yeah, they do. I mean, how much of us will they sell? You know, because the whole trajectory that the Met Council has done, it has been incremental. You know, first of all, we're not going to have co-location at all, and then we are going to have co-location. And you hear them saying just a few minutes ago, well, we'll figure out those construction problems. Well, then they don't figure them out, and so then they push us the next step, and they push us the next step. And that's really what the judge is talking about, because they lead us so far down the path that we cannot possibly go back. So the thing is half built, and they say, I'm sorry, we have to take houses, the Calhoun Isles is falling apart, and the city council will say, oh, there are some winners and some losers. Sorry, you're the losers.
I asked Mike this about our issue as well. Are you all going to sort of galvanize at the legislature to, in the whole funding issue for the remaining, what is it, $138 million?
Certainly. We have been working with legislators we've already been working with legislators on both sides of the aisle.
Okay, great. All right, thanks.
Thanks, Janet.
Water, it's a water issue.
Thank you.
You know, on municipal consent, if the city did say no, the state law requires that they have a reasonable alternative. What is the reasonable alternative once it's half built?
Good question, Bob.
At this point, you may think you've heard everything, but you haven't. I followed up with Councilmember Reich on what might happen if the tunnel can't be built. Before summing up for this way too long chapter, here's the somewhat winding path to and through that interview. It's October 27th, and I'm here with Councilmember Reich, who is the chair of the Transportation Committee. I met with Councilmember Reich in his office for about half an hour that day to both present information on my alternative Southwest LRT plan and on bus-based transit alternatives more generally, and for a brief interview. Reich is a very busy guy. Unfortunately, we ran out of time that day for the interview. Councilmember Goodman has raised this entire process, a number of very important questions.
Can we do this another time? I'm sorry.
Yeah, can we?
I'm late.
Okay. I don't call myself Bob again for nothing.
So you just want to hold until then? Is that what you're saying?
Yeah, exactly.
Okay. All right.
Real good. Thanks, Lisa. We were able to complete the interview over the phone 2 days later, with results that I think are both very surprising and frankly also very disturbing. Just wanted to finish up this interview. I've got you on a speakerphone.
Sorry I had to run out. I didn't want to be late for my committee meeting because they had a quorum issue.
No, it's no problem. I've got a cell phone going here with speakerphone and videotaping the cell phone. So we're on. Here we go.
I never looked better.
Okay, so here we go. This is a transcript from the vote, the full council vote. So, Lisa Goodman started out, and she said, so I think one of the biggest problems we have today is we're going to go ahead, you guys are going to go ahead and move this forward, and in the end they're not going to be able to build the tunnel. And then Councilmember Yang made some comments, I'm just going to excerpt. He said, I think Councilmember Goodman is right in a lot of what she said, and you know, I do have a lot of sympathy for a lot of her constituents and a lot of the folks that came to testify at this public hearing, and those words those folks said with regard to their neighborhood and the impact on their lives are very real. But you know, I guess in some ways we just have to balance what's good for some folks over other folks, and as Councilmember Goodman has said in the past, sometimes in these situations you just have to pick winners and losers. Now then, Councilmember Bender, you had a suspension of the rules so some of the Met Council staff could testify, and her second question to Craig Lamuth, who's the project director for Southwest Light Rail, she said, the second question is, I wonder Councilmember Goodman has raised questions in this entire process, a number of very important questions about construction methods and their impacts on water quality on adjacent properties, and I wonder if someone could address some of those questions, particularly about the construction methods. And Lamuth said, as we get more and more closer to the time of construction, we're continuing to take a look at the actual construction staging and the construction methods we'll be using, continuing to do additional research on making sure that we're using the best practices in the corridor, regardless of whether it's being tunnels or bridges or just track work. And then Councilmember Bender said, and finally, what would happen if there was a major change to the project? And Lamuth said specifically to Councilmember Goodman's question about the tunnel potentially not being there, that would trigger another round of municipal consent. Now, so here's the bottom line. It really looks to me that the way is being paved to be prepared for a situation where the tunnel can't be built.
and it really is a question. So my first question is, do you think there is a serious question as to whether that tunnel can be built?
Well, my understanding is that it's a high probability that the tunnel will be built as contemplated. There may be some questions as to, maybe some of the construction techniques, reinforcement, water management specific to it. But I think in general terms, we have enough engineering understanding that a tunnel can go there, it can be built, and so that's the understanding of myself, and that's certainly what was stated by council in general.
Okay, and basically, I have to say, I'm not holding you accountable to that because you're not the engineer. This is what you're being told. But here's the next question: suppose the tunnel cannot be built. So at that point, suppose we're in a situation where everything's started. The construction is underway, and it turns out the tunnel cannot be built. Does it seem that there's any reasonable alternative other than to do whatever is necessary to get the light rail and the freight rail through the corridor? Isn't that really what it boils down to? That if the tunnel can't be built, then it would be necessary to do whatever is necessary to get the thing built. Do you think that's a fair statement?
I believe that some serious questions along those lines would be raised to the point where does it really call into question co-location at that point? One of the solutions that kind of came in probably too late in the process was when the independent analysis for the rerouting of the freight. Something that Minneapolis was very keen on pursuing, even in a later hour, right to the end. We wanted to pursue that, and where an independent group said, not only would rerouting be feasible, but on one scenario, it looked like it would be the same as or even less than, how they treated the freight rail with the current proposal. So here we have a cost neutral or cost beneficial option, but it's just one of those things where that would have been good to have had that analysis and that conclusion probably 3 to 5 years prior. So does that get reopened? I would say so. The rerouting of the freight would be the first thing that I would look at. One of the things that's very significant also about the tunnel is not only how it manages the confluence of freight and passenger rail, is that there's another mode that we take very seriously here in Minneapolis and actually in the metro region in general, which is our bike trails, particularly high-use bike trails. The Cedar Trail is not just a fun little thing. It moves a lot of people. As a matter of fact, more people move through the Cedar Trail than many of our major corridors in the city of Minneapolis, our car corridors. So it's no small, trifling, fun thing. It's a serious thing. And in fact, that we need that tunnel to accommodate it, as far as I understand, unless they can come up with another layout solution that preserves that trail, which again serves many, many people. It'd be like cutting off Lake Street, car traffic. That's serious and significant, I believe. They're going to have to come up with some real solutions, alternative solutions. Again, my first guess, and this is just me speaking, would be to look at that analysis that showed rerouting of the freight that would not require co-location at that point. But that's a bridge we will cross when we get to it, I suppose.
But just the bottom line, do you agree that at that point it would be too late to take a look at a new alignment? You'd have to do whatever is necessary to get the light rail through the Kenilworth corridor. Do you think that's true?
No, I don't, because the fact that they have to, and I think the federal government puts these safety measures in place. If you change what was agreed upon in a significant way, and there's clear definitions of what that is, and they even state, as you pointed out, the tunnel issue would be so significant they would have to go back for a municipal consent. That's where how we address the situation, the parties would have to agree to that. And if we find that they came up with something that was disagreeable, we wouldn't give consent. I think the things we would be looking at would be that alternative, that route that came up from an independent analysis that showed the feasibility of a rerouting of freight that would not require co-location at that point. And that's the first place I think I would personally go, and I'm sure there'd be others eager on the city council that would probably at least give that a good consideration out of the gate.
But what I hear you saying then is that suppose that you can't reroute the freight and you can't build the tunnel, are you saying that a route, for example, for the light rail through Uptown would still be on the table?
Actually, I was specifically referring to the reroute of freight because that was the last promising study that we saw. In terms of revisiting the rerouting through Uptown, on a high level, the city's always said that that was our preferred route. For practically a decade now, we've said, touching the urban core and serving more people in the urban core is always our preference. That certainly would float up. How far it would get in terms of our stance, I don't know, but I would be surprised if it didn't become part of the conversation again.
Okay, so just to push this a little further then, if the tunnel cannot be built and freight cannot be rerouted, you're saying that it would still be possible, even once construction of the whole system is started, to look at an alternative light rail route that would go through Uptown?
From my position, I would say why not?
Okay.
It's your lane track one way or the other, right?
Mm-hmm. Now let me ask you this then: do you think that there might be an argument made that, well, this would be so impractical that we just need to tear down the townhouses? Do you think that that option would be on the table?
Boy, it could be. They've not really offered that, and I know there's always a hesitation to do takings. Yeah, that'd be a pretty significant stance if they did offer that up, and I don't know how well received it would be.
Okay, well, I appreciate this background, and so this will be going into the next chapter of this video, and I hope that we can continue to talk going forward. And I appreciate talking with you earlier about the other options that I'm promoting that we consider.
Right, and you're familiar with the that last study that they had that consultant do regarding freight routing?
The guy from Trans Systems?
Yes.
Yeah, I am.
Oh, well, you're on top of it then.
Okay.
All right.
Real good. Well, thanks, Councilmember Eck. Appreciate it.
Anytime. Have a good day.
You too. Take care. Bye-bye. It's time to wrap up this way too long chapter by considering what must be your own central and blindingly obvious question. Why doesn't the Met Council take a real look at an alternative route through Uptown before charging into the construction phase? The Uptown route would solve the problem with Kenilworth and freight co-location. Unfortunately, the mainstream media has effectively ignored this question. In the next chapter, we'll uncover why the Met Council is so incredibly determined to just push ahead with their current route through Kenilworth. As we'll see, there actually is an explanation for what the Met Council is doing. It's a weird one, having to do with the complicated process of funding light rail projects, both in Minnesota and around the country. But there is an explanation, and understanding it is the first step in getting this whole mess straightened out. Here's the bottom line. The prospect is still good for either stopping Southwest LRT or getting the alignment out of Kenilworth. I could live with either option, and maybe so could you. That's it for Chapter 3. Meanwhile, we're heading into the holiday season, so Merry Christmas and Happy New Year. For more information about this video series, and at least 2 different ways to contribute, please visit my website, www.bobagain.com.